Ukraine's security is, of course, set to be a major topic for U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during his talks in China. Blinken wants to stabilize ties with Beijing, but also to ramp up pressure over its close relationship with Russia. Washington accuses China of helping Moscow with its invasion of Ukraine, which it denies.
Antony Blinken's visit comes at a challenging time for China-US relations. Arriving in Shanghai, he posted this video on building bridges.
And of course, we'll be dealing with areas where we have real differences with China, dealing with them directly, communicating clearly. Face-to-face diplomacy matters. It's important for avoiding miscommunications, misperceptions, and to advance the interests of the American people.
As well as building his own bridges, Blinken will be trying to steer China away from Russia, accusing Beijing of backing Moscow's war in Ukraine.
China continues to provide materials to support Russia's defense industrial base. And all of this is fueling Putin's war machine as he attacks Ukrainians and threatens European security.
China insists it remains neutral.
China has always controlled the export of dual-use items in accordance with laws and regulations. Relevant countries should not smear and attack what are normal state-to-state relations between China and Russia.
It's not just the war in Ukraine that's causing strain. The discovery of a Chinese spy balloon in US skies last year added to tensions, along with US support for Taiwan. With 3 days of talks in Shanghai and Beijing, Blinken has his work cut out smoothing relations between the superpowers.
With U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken in China for talks, I'd like to get some analysis by bringing in Rory, Managing Director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, a U.S.-based think tank. A very warm welcome to the show today. Shortly before Antony Blinken arrived in Shanghai, the Chinese state news agency quoted an unnamed ministry representative as essentially saying the U.S. is interfering in China's internal affairs and smearing its image. What kind of welcome do you think Blinken can expect?
Well, I think that both the U.S. and China are in incredibly tight political environments right now. You've just run a very moving piece about the war in Ukraine, which is an issue that the U.S. and China have deep, deep differences on. So I think that Blinken will have a standard diplomatic welcome, a cordial welcome, but certainly there are a lot of issues to address in the U.S.-China relationship that will require some very candid and uncomfortable conversations. And I think Secretary Blinken is well poised to continue those conversations.
Let's talk a little bit more about the Ukraine issue, which, as you've said, will be high on the agenda. Last week, Blinken suggested that Beijing is essentially playing a double game here, wanting good relations with Europe while also supporting Russia. Is his assessment a fair one, do you think?
Absolutely. I think that Chinese economic and strategic priorities lend themselves to these types of policy contradictions. On the one hand, China does need the European market as an export market for its goods. On the other hand, it has an equally to itself important economic relationship with Russia, which is becoming an increasingly vital part of China's energy security, but also its food security as it seeks to further development between China and Russia on, grain trade. So I think that beyond that, strategically, China, while it understands the intense international concern and approbation of Russia's violation of Ukraine's sovereignty, also is very sympathetic to the Russian view that it's been provoked by an expanding alliance network. And when China looks at its own periphery and its neighbors and sees so many U.S. allies and partners trying to balance its economic and military power in the region, it lends itself towards supporting Russia. So you can see how all of these different strategic priorities do create contradictions in policy. And that's exactly why these visits, such as the one by Secretary of State Blinken, are so important. It's about influencing that balance of interest in ways that are favorable to peace and stability, not just in Europe, but all over the world.
So what kind of influence do you think it is realistic that Blinken could have here, given those interests and Chinese worldview that you've just described?
I think it's going to be a challenge for sure. I think part of the understated value of these types of visits is that it does give each policy community an opportunity to kind of reassess its interest in regards to that balance, that bigger strategic balance. And that type of action forcing mechanism or conversation forcing mechanism that makes each policy community really sit down and say, do our policy assumptions work for the time that we're in, can be a slow movement of the needle over time. I think right now in U.S.-China relations, things are so tense, and particularly, China's very strong opposition to U.S. support for Taiwan does block opportunities to cooperate or to rethink those strategic priorities writ large. But it doesn't mean that they're not important opportunities to gather information and, again, to consolidate each country's own thinking on what it needs from the other side.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about that, because, of course, the relationship with Russia, not the only controversial point. You've hinted at the Taiwan question. The U.S. Congress has just approved a new aid package for Taiwan, which includes arms support for the island. How do you think that is going to play out in talks with Blinken in China?
I think it's one of the most sensitive issues for the Chinese and really reflective of deep, deep differences in how to approach the Taiwan issue. The aid package that was passed is relatively flexible, so I think that some explanation might be useful for Secretary Blinken to give on how that aid package will be enacted. If that comes up in conversation, I think that would be helpful. But I think overall, there remains a sense in the U.S. policy community, and I believe in the U.S. government, that the best option for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait is for the U.S. and its allies and partners to help balance China's military power, and particularly its coercive power over Taiwan, through these types of military aid packages. So I think all of those issues will certainly be on the table, and I think China will give very strong opinions against increasing U.S.-Taiwan defense cooperation.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. That is Rory Daniels from the Asia Society Policy Institute.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And I'm very pleased to welcome Kelly Grieco with the Stimson Center, a foreign affairs think tank in Washington, D.C., for more on this story. Now, we've heard Biden is promising military aid is on its way very shortly after he's signed off on billions of dollars in new spending for Ukraine. Before we turn to Blinken in China, I just want to ask you how much you think this new aid package will help in Ukraine.
Yes, well, thank you for having me. I think the new aid package will help Ukraine to be able to sustain its defense this year. It still has the very significant manpower crisis, which you were just speaking about, but it will help with huge shortages in ammunition, air defense weapons. And the real question then I think becomes what will happen after that. This could potentially be the last major aid package from the United States, and so how Ukraine will find a more sustainable path on defense.
And the timing is interesting, isn't it? Just after Blinken landed in Shanghai. How do you think the passage of this aid package will affect the Secretary of State's discussions in China?
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting that one of the issues the administration seems to have made its priority in these meetings is the issue of what they see as Chinese support for Russia's industrial base. From the Chinese perspective, they argue that the U.S. is upset about dual-use technologies, things like machine tools and semiconductor parts, but that those are things that are just part of normal trade. The United States obviously feels differently about that. And I think it's interesting with this aid package, I can imagine the Chinese, as part of their response, will say, well, you are sending weapons to Ukraine. We're not even sending weapons to Russia. They have held back on that. And I think this will be actually one of the major focuses of the meeting and a real point of tension.
Now, given that dynamic, what tools does the U.S. actually have in its belt to try to push China to reduce its support for Russia?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is what I find so curious about the administration choosing to highlight this issue is that it has very little room for maneuver on it and to actually influence China. Ahead of these meetings, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal that the administration has drafted sanctions to impose on Chinese banks. Now, the problem with that is that many of the Chinese banks that deal with the dollar actually have already stopped doing trade, facilitating trade with Russia because they were already worried about secondary sanctions. And as a result, a lot of the banks that are doing this trade with Russia are now these secondary regional banks that don't deal with the dollar. So the kinds of sanctions they're talking about imposing would actually not target the very banks that are conducting this kind of trade.
Now, it's interesting then, like you say, that they're hanging their hat on this as a major issue for the trip. We should say this new aid came as part of a law that has included two other things that China likely won't be very happy about. Let's look first at one provision, forcing TikTok to either be sold by its Chinese owner or be banned eventually in the United States. This over the United States concern that data could end up in the hands of the Chinese government. Will this be raised in discussions?
Yes, I mean, I think this has actually taken the Chinese a little by surprise because there had been a similar motion in March in the Senate and it hadn't passed. And so I think they thought that had sort of resolved itself. Leading up to Blinken's trip, a spokesperson for the Chinese was asked about this, and they essentially said that they didn't have a comment. We could refer, look back at what they've said in the past. They've opposed this kind of effort in the past. I think that this is likely to play out, though, not as much in diplomacy as in U.S. courtrooms. This law will be challenged in U.S. courts on First Amendment grounds, and in the past, the courts have ruled against this kind of forced sale of TikTok. So I expect this will probably play out in the coming months and years.
Okay, now looking at Blinken in China, again, this package passed by Biden, this law, it also does set aside assistance to Taiwan. This is another sore point for Beijing. And Beijing has condemned it as a dangerous provocation. On this issue, will they be able to find any common ground?
Yeah, so I think there is one place where they'll find common ground potentially, which is that in next month, a little less than a month from now, there will be an inauguration for Taiwan's new president. And I think both sides are very concerned about this moment and trying to make sure that things remain stable and there isn't some kind of inadvertent escalation. So I think on that, there'll be communication about that. The Chinese have signaled that they would like Secretary Blinken to publicly reaffirm again U.S. support for a one China policy. I think there's a high likelihood that we will see that. Beyond that, though, at least in terms of the issue of the kind of military aid the United States is providing to Taiwan, I don't think that there will be any movement on that issue. I think the United States will hold firm.
So just to bring this all home, what will the metric by which to measure success be here? What does Blinken need to come away with from this trip to call it a win?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see any big deliverables or announcements on this trip. I think if I were to give it a slogan, I would say it's agree to disagree. That's the theme of the trip will be agree to disagree. And the success will be the fact that we're actually engaging in face-to-face diplomacy and that there'll be a reaffirmation, a recommitment to continuing to make, government-to-government contacts and dialogue, something that had broken down and really until San Francisco in November, and just basically continuing with that process and remaining committed to it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. That was really valuable. That's Kelly Grieco from the Stimson Center.